Beneath Seoul's shifting skies, a daughter's return to secrets, silence, and the shadows of power that claimed her father's legacy and almost her own. Seoul loomed before Sohyun like a city reborn, but its shimmering skyline and bustling tempo offered her no comfort. Everything was different, now more chaotic, taller, and louder, but buried beneath the glass towers and electronic noise were fragments of a life that clung to her like shadows. A decade away had not erased the memories. Rather, time had compressed them into sharp points that now pierced her with every step. The old alleyways, the subtle curve of a hill, the smell of roasted chestnuts on a cold breeze, these things tethered her to a past she had tried and failed to outrun. Her return hadn't been guided by whimsy or nostalgia. It had come wrapped in the brittle parchment of a letter short, cryptic, cold. Her half-brother Ji-hoon had sent it, and though they had never shared affection, he knew just how to draw her back. He had promised her the truth. That word truth had haunted her ever since she read his note. She had built a life elsewhere, far removed from this city and the fractured home it once contained, but all it took was that single promise to shatter her illusion of distance. Because the truth was never far. It had always followed her like a ghost, unseen but ever present. She stood before the rusting gates of the family home, where memories whispered from every brick and vine. Once vibrant and filled with the color of her father's beloved garden, it was now little more than a husk. The flowers had long since withered, their absence a symbol of the man who had cultivated them with care and joy. Weeds claimed the pathways, and the silence inside the walls was not of peace but of abandonment. The house had never offered warmth after her father's passing, just the cold governance of Madame Han and the pointed absence of any maternal comfort. Grief had built walls around her after her father's death, walls that neither love nor reason could penetrate. She had been young when it happened, and the secrecy surrounding the incident had only deepened her pain. Whispers behind closed doors, documents that vanished, and looks exchanged by adults who refused to meet her eyes had been her inheritance. Ji-hoon had withdrawn into silence after the funeral, his disdain for her barely concealed. There was no family left, just broken pieces in a house that no longer felt like home. She didn't enter, not yet. Instead, she turned away from the house and toward the city, toward the place where the truth might be hiding. She would not find answers in hollow corridors and dust-covered memories. The legacy of her father was spread across Seoul, woven into the city's business circles and old political alliances. Her family's name still held weight, even in her absence. That weight had crushed her before, but perhaps now she could use it to pry open the secrets. Her next steps led her toward a place she had once considered a haven. The district had changed, like everything else, but the apartment tower stood resilient, a blend of glass and steel in the city's center. Her heart grew heavy as she approached it. Kim Min-joon had once lived here, and still did, she believed. His name was etched into her past as deeply as any memory. They had once been something fragile and beautiful, a quiet rebellion against the rigid walls of her world. But even love had not been immune to the fracture lines drawn by betrayal and grief. He had been the one to investigate her father's death. Back then, she had trusted him more than she had trusted herself. But the investigation had grown sharp edges. It cut through the lies, the carefully placed veils her family had drawn over the truth, and what it revealed had broken them. She hadn't wanted to know what he uncovered then. Her need to protect what little was left of her world had outweighed her need to understand it. They parted bitterly, each carrying wounds the other had inflicted. Now, years later, she found herself in front of his door once more, breath caught between regret and determination. The apartment still bore the same minimalist structure she remembered. Clean lines, cold surfaces, muted tones. It was a home only in function, never in feeling. She stepped inside with the same care she used to approach her father's study, knowing one wrong word might shatter what little ground she stood on. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. The silence between them was dense with the past. It was an uneasy truce, a fragile pause before old wounds reopened. He had changed, but the shadow of who he had been lingered in his posture, in the way he held her gaze without flinching. She could see the exhaustion etched into his expression, years of digging, years of quiet battles against forces too entrenched to name. He hadn't stopped searching. That much was clear. She settled into the cold chair opposite him. Her eyes drifted to the view beyond the window. Seoul glittered with life, yet offered none of it here. The city had moved on without them, while they had remained suspended in time. Every second in that room felt like a reckoning. She knew why he had asked her to come, just as she knew there were things she didn't want to hear. But the truth could no longer be silenced. Her father's death had never been the accident the newspapers proclaimed. Too many details had never made sense. Too many people had worked too hard to close the case. The silence between them was not empty. It brimmed with questions neither dared to ask. But the weight of what had brought her here demanded confrontation. She could feel it in her bones, the need to unearth what had been buried, even if it destroyed the remnants of what they once were. She rose, her gaze drawn again to the skyline. The city before her had changed beyond recognition, but she remained bound to it. Its secrets were her inheritance. Her return was not the end of a journey, but its true beginning. What lay ahead was murky, dangerous, and soaked in memories, but she could not walk away. Not now. The truth waited for her beneath Seoul's neon skin, and Sohyun at last was ready to uncover it. The following morning arrived wrapped in a curtain of gray clouds, casting Seoul in a dim, subdued light. Sohyun moved through the city like a shadow, her thoughts heavy with the weight of the night before. The silence between her and Minjun had spoken volumes. It was not forgiveness, nor was it reconciliation. It was merely recognition of what they had lost, of what they still needed to uncover. She had not slept. Instead, she had sat by the window of a hotel room she didn't remember choosing, watching the city as it refused to rest, lights flickering like nervous thoughts. By noon, she found herself walking the old financial district, where her father had built the empire that had both empowered and consumed him. His face still appeared in framed photographs within boardrooms and plaques outside foundation buildings, an image frozen in time, stoic, composed, untouchable. But behind the eyes in those photos, she now saw something else. Not strength, but a quiet dread. She began to suspect that her father had not merely died, he had been silenced. She visited the law firm that once handled her family's affairs. The building had been renovated, its interior redone with modern glass walls and sleek marble floors, but the air remained the same, clean, cold, and measured. Few people remembered her face, but her name still commanded attention. Her inquiries were met with polite deflection, veiled discomfort, and the sort of carefully worded answers that hinted at deeper truths. Her father's case had been declared closed within days of his death. No further inquiries had ever been made. There was no documentation that pointed to foul play. But the ease with which doors were now shutting only confirmed her suspicions. As the hours passed, her search took her to a name she had buried deep, Chairman Kwon. A long-time associate of her father, he had been more like an uncle once, until her father's death fractured every alliance. The old man's influence had grown since then, though he had drifted from public view. She learned through quiet sources that Kwon still ran his affairs from a heavily guarded estate north of the river. It was there, behind layers of security and secrecy, that the real power resided, power that had outlived even her father. With Minjun's discreet help, she secured a meeting. It was a risk, but one she had to take. The car that carried her to the estate wound its way through old pine forests and narrow hills, a stark contrast to the city's glass and steel. When the gates opened, the world seemed to change. It was quieter here, almost timeless. The estate was vast, manicured to perfection, the sort of place where secrets were preserved rather than buried. Inside, Chairman Kwon greeted her with a measured politeness. His health had declined, but his presence remained commanding. He looked at her with recognition, his expression unreadable. The conversation was careful. She offered no accusations, only questions, but each one chipped at the mask he wore. His answers were rehearsed and diplomatic, but his silences revealed more than his words. He denied any involvement in her father's demise, yet his dismissive tone toward the investigation hinted at complicity. There were names he refused to mention. Decisions he claimed were before her time. But in the pauses between his sentences, she began to hear the truth. Her father had been working on something like an internal audit, a full review of assets tied to illicit political contributions, and a hidden web of offshore accounts. He had begun to question people he had once trusted, and in doing so he had sealed his fate. The pressure had come swiftly, quietly. When he refused to back down, the threats escalated. There were no records, only stories left untold, locked behind loyalty and fear. What happened to him was not a crime in the legal sense, but a coordinated silencing of a heart attack induced by stress, compounded by medication, overlooked by corrupt doctors and police unwilling to open a case. Kwon admitted nothing. But Seohyun left the estate with a hollow certainty. Her father had known too much, and those who once stood beside him had let him fall for their own survival. In the following days, she sought out other former staff, drivers, and assistants. Most were gone, relocated, or unwilling to speak. One elderly maid who had worked in the house for decades told her in hushed tones that on the night her father died, Ji-hoon had not been at home. He had been meeting with someone in secret, a man with connections to Kwon. The timing was too precise to ignore. Seohyun's blood ran cold at the implication. She had always believed her half-brother's bitterness was passive, but now she saw it could have been something more self-preserving, even complicit. She returned to the family house. This time, she forced open the gate and stepped inside. The air was thick with decay and neglect. Dust covered the shelves in her father's study, and yet, something felt untouched, intentionally preserved. She searched the drawers, the hidden compartments beneath the floorboards, and the safe behind the bookshelf. Inside, she found a journal. Her father's handwriting spilled across its pages in rushed ink, notes and dates and names that traced a path through the underbelly of power. It was not a confession, but a warning, a record of pressure he had faced, of accounts he had begun to trace. At the end of the journal was a single line underlined twice. If anything happens to me, it was not an accident. Her hands trembled as she closed the book. She had found it not just the truth, but the weight of her father's final fight. It wasn't enough to clear his name in public. No one would reopen the case. No court would try these men. But she knew what to do. She met Minjun one final time, handing him the journal without words. His eyes scanned the first few pages, and she saw the return of something fierce in him. The past could not be undone, but it could be illuminated. They would not seek vengeance, only justice in its quietest, most persistent form. So-hyun didn't stay long after. The city no longer felt like a stranger, but it didn't feel like home either. She had come for answers, and now that she had them, she felt neither peace nor closure, only a strange emptiness, like the space left behind after a storm. As her plane ascended, Seoul sprawled beneath her in silence. Somewhere down there, the truth now existed in the open, hidden in plain sight. The city had changed. She had changed. But in that change, something enduring remained. The truth had found its voice, and that at last was enough.